Hey everybody, in this video I want to study period 2, so I'm going to review some things with you regarding this era in history. For the 2020 APUSH exam, I actually don't want you to study period 2 all that much. I want you to study periods 3 through 7 because the DBQ for the 2020 APUSH exam is going to be oriented more so to those periods. So for anybody watching this video that's taking the 2020 APUSH exam, this would be good for contextualization. And so let's study it, but let's make sure that we spend more time on periods 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So I want to start off with this. Here you have a screenshot of my website. You can see the address at the top, and please let me know if you have trouble getting to the website. But if you go to my website, you'll go all the way over to the very far top right corner right there. It says more, and you'll go all the way down to review material. You'll click on that, and it'll take you to the page that has all of my review material stuff on it. If you go to this page, you'll see where it says link the review documents, and then below you'll see good YouTube review channels. You'll even see my channel that's there as well, good review material. You click on that, and it'll take you to a Google folder in a Google Drive. You'll scroll down to where it says period 2 review, and you'll find the review handout that actually goes with this particular PowerPoint and will follow along with this video that we're about to go through here in a moment. So it would be a good idea to maybe print off a copy of that or take some notes as we kind of go along with it as well. All right, so let's get to it. Period 2 is from 1607 to 1754. 1607 is important because that's the date where Jamestown was founded. And 1754 is the beginning of the French and Indian War. They picked those two dates for a reason. So period 2, important events. 1607, as mentioned earlier, Jamestown is founded by the Virginia Company, one of these joint stock companies. Remember, a joint stock company is unique because those were wealthy investors that pooled their money together. No longer did we have to go and rely upon kings and queens to go in and finance voyages across the sea. Now, for the most part, Virginia Company is looking to turn a profit, as all these joint stock companies were at the time. And so what they have in mind is searching for gold over in Virginia, named after Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. And so they built Jamestown in a bad location over in a swamp, a lot of disease and mosquitoes. And the people they brought with them were predominantly gentlemen looking for adventures. Gentlemen were wealthy people back in England. They did not have to really work all that hard. They weren't used to farming or anything. So they had a lot of troubles as they first come to the New World itself. John Smith changed all that. Captain John Smith comes in and basically establishes martial law, says he that will not work shall not eat, and sets up trading relationships with the local Powhatan and Indians, and there begins the story of Pocahontas. Jamestown actually almost dies out during a time called the Starving Time during the winter. Of I want to say 1608 and '09. And so during that time period, they did resort to cannibalism. John Smith had been injured; he had to go back to England. So without his leadership, the settlement almost failed. So in comes the story of John Rolfe. John Rolfe introduced tobacco. Tobacco ultimately is what will save Jamestown. It was actually illegal. The Spanish tobacco, it was illegal for them to be planting that, but they did anyway. And they found that they could turn a profit in Jamestown not by gold, but actually by raising tobacco. 1619 is where you have the introduction of slavery into the United States. The Dutch are actually the first to begin to sell slaves in the United States in 1619. It does amount to something called the Middle Passage between Africa and the Caribbean and North America, where slaves were being transported from Africa to the New World and being put into a system of forced labor. There is the interesting story of Olaudah Equiano, one of the first people to be able to escape out of slavery and then record his story. We read accounts from Olaudah Equiano describing the horrors of the Middle Passage itself. During this time period, you're also starting to see an increase in Puritanism. Now, Puritans, I like to think of them as the most radical of the radical as far as Christians go. They were very, very strict. They did not believe in music. They did not believe in Christmas. If it was not literally in the Bible, that we should be doing something or we should not be celebrating this or that, and they didn't do it. And so they believed at the time that the Anglican Church needed to be reformed even further, no Catholic elements. So be familiar with the beliefs of Puritans and push-pull factors. Push factors, why were they being pushed out of England? They were persecuted. And what drew them to America, what pulled them to America, was the idea of religious freedom and to be able to worship God in their own special way. So it's kind of interesting. The first English settlers are really, I like to think of them as a bunch of religious freaks as they come over here in search of a land where they could practice the freedom of religion. So in 1620, the Pilgrims will land over at Plymouth. Now, the Plymouth Company itself was one of these joint stock companies. Although they did bring Puritans with them, they also brought many workers with them as well as they traveled along across the Atlantic Ocean on board the Mayflower itself. The Plymouth Company was interested in creating a fishing colony, but the Puritans, as mentioned earlier, they were looking to go and establish a place where they could worship in their own special way. Along the way, they signed the Mayflower Compact, which was basically an agreement of self-government that they would all work together for their common or their greater good. Some people draw some parallels to the communism, actually, with the Mayflower Compact. Everybody worked together, and everybody's going to live for the greater good of the colony itself. They did run into a Native American tribe called the Wampanoags during this time. These are this is the tribe where you'll have the very first Thanksgiving. It's kind of interesting as we kind of continue on our study. By 1675, the Wampanoags, the Pilgrims, are actually going to be at war much later on down the road. But they do celebrate the very first Thanksgiving. They do survive, due in part to their reliance upon the Native Americans. So that's a big theme for the English. They did rely on the Native Americans, but they also wound up going to battle with them and going and fighting a series of wars with them as well later on down the road. 1624 is the founding of New Amsterdam by the Dutch. It was mostly set up as a trading colony. Later, the English will forcibly take New Amsterdam in this area, this New Netherland region, and they'll take it, and eventually it actually becomes known as New York. And so that it's going to be taken. Actually, the colony wasn't do that wonderful, and the Dutch were actually okay with being taken over. So 1624, that happens. Now, the second wave of Puritans that come to America, by the way, they're called first wave immigrants. These Puritans, these first wave immigrants coming to our country, they the second group of Puritans to come form a colony called the Massachusetts Bay Colony itself. Now, John Winthrop is one of the most famous people on board, leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. As they're sailing across the sea, he gives a very notable and famous sermon called the City Upon a Hill Sermon, or is actually known as a model of Christian charity, but some people refer to it as just the City Upon a Hill Sermon itself. Now, what do you mean by the City Upon a Hill? America, we shall be, or excuse me, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, we shall be as a city upon a hill. Everybody will look up to us as a good role model colony for the rest of the world. We've got it figured out. Follow us. Now, there were some people who disagreed with the way the governments were being run in Massachusetts. There were people like Roger Williams who disagreed with the fact that you had to be a member of the church in order to be able to participate in the government itself. And so he begins advocating ideas such as the separation of church and state, two different things. They shouldn't be blended together. If you do blend them together, you get a theocracy. So he was looked at as a heretic. He was actually banished from Massachusetts. So he founded his own colony called Rhode Island in the 1630s. And it became a refuge for heretics. It became a refuge for people who were looking for a place to worship. And so it was looked at as a place where religious toleration was advocated. You also get people like Anne Hutchinson, who were major important figures over on Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson, being a woman, began leading Bible studies, saying you could pray directly to God. All this goes against the beliefs of the Puritans. So she too was banished, and she will make her way over to Rhode Island and find refuge there as well. King Philip's War broke out in 1675. The Wampanoags revolted against the English due to forced English law. They had to obey English law and the loss of their lands. After the Great Swamp Fight, when King Philip, who's also known as Metacom, was killed, the British will win. King Philip's War will be over with, and the colonists are able to do this without help from the British. So it's interesting because you're starting to see little moments of independence where we can do things on our own without having the mother country come in and help us. The Pueblo Revolt is huge. You've got to be able to study that. In 1680, the Pueblo Revolt breaks out in the Southwest. It's also known as Pope's Rebellion. And the reason it happened is Native Americans, the Pueblo, revolted because the Spanish conversions and missions. So the natives were being sent to missions and forcibly converted. And so what's interesting about the Pueblo revolt is they actually are successful. They actually kick out the Spanish. Normally you hear it about the other way around. They kick out the Spanish. Later on down the road, they'll be reconquered. They don't have the same weaponry and armor and so forth. But it is a big moment where you do have a successful revolt from Native Americans against the Spaniards over there in that region, New Spain. And of course, in 1692, you have the famous Salem witch trials, where a slave girl from Barbados named Tituba claimed that she had been taught in the ways of witchcraft. Two girls had accused Tituba of going in and causing them to have these kind of these epileptic kind of fits. And they said that the reason that happened is because they were bewitched. But if you really look at the Salem witch trials, what's interesting is who is accusing who, and you have a lot of poor people accusing wealthy people of being witches. People on one side of the town where the land isn't as good accusing people on the other side of the town, people who have the better land, of being witches. And so even today, modern day historians are kind of thinking that maybe there was something up with that. People are looking to gain land and territory as well. There's also the scientific question of ergot, which is kind of like a hallucinogenic. Gives you kind of the effects of LSD. It's kind of a fungus growing on all of the wheat and grains, and so people believe that maybe they were kind of like high on LSD when they were going in and having these epileptic fits. 20 were executed, but ultimately it was a very scary moment during that time. I'd be familiar with New England, New Spain, and New France. With the English, they were much more about economic opportunities for the joint stock companies, like the Plymouth Company, the Virginia Company that we studied earlier. They were interested in gold. Always remember the three G's when we're talking about England, Spain, and France. God, gold, and glory. Like, why are these people coming here, and what are they in search of? And so for the English, they are interested in wealth and riches. For example, Queen Elizabeth I used a group of privateers, not pirates, privateers. They were paid by the government. They were called sea dogs. The greatest example is Sir Francis Drake, who goes on leads raids in places like St. Augustine, Florida, where the Spanish are set up, and they take all their gold from them. Where are they settled for New England? Mostly northeast, in the northeast United States, modern day U.S., on the Atlantic coast, and starting in over in Virginia with Jamestown. What were they looking for? Cash crops. They were looking for gold originally, but they found that cash crops like tobacco, that's really how they made their money. They engaged in a system of mercantilism where we made the raw materials and we provided that to the mother country, and they made something out of it, and then they sold that money. They sold it off. So mercantilism, merchant, is a way of making money. We weren't supposed to be industrialized here. We just go and make the raw materials and send them overseas. That is mercantilism itself. Free labor source. Originally, the English bring in indentured servants. Sometimes their contracts would be about 4 years or so, where this is contracted labor. They were too poor to pay for their own passage across the sea, so somebody else paid for them to go. And in response, they signed a contract. And then once their contract is up, then they could be free to go and make a life wherever they want. Later on, indentured servants will not be used, and that is in due part to something called Bacon's Rebellion, a huge deal that I want you to make sure you study it as well. We'll go back and look at that later on as well. So eventually they'll swap over to slavery because of a revolt of a bunch of indentured servants who actually burned down Jamestown. New Spain, a desire for gold and conquered land. These are your conquistadors exploring and taking land and forcing the natives into a style of slavery called the encomienda system. Predominantly, this in Mexico, in the Southwest, and Florida. They are looking for gold, but ultimately, what they found was that they could make money off of ranching. A lot of ranching, mining gold and silver. Missions were used to convert Native Americans. During time, that's where you get the story of Pope Hayes Rebellion or the Pueblo Revolt. The inconvenience system is something that is usually tested on the APUSH exam. This is huge. This is a style of slavery where natives were forced into slavery. They had to go mine gold and silver, and the conquistadors had to agree to feed them and protect them in exchange for that forced labor. It decimates the population of the natives, along with all the diseases that spread. It is a terrible, terrible moment. Eventually, they will get rid of the encomienda system. France probably had the greatest relationship with the Native Americans. They were searching for something called the Northwest Passage or a trade route over to Asia. And so, where are they settling in? Canada, mostly. You'll see them in Louisiana. They are looking mostly to make money off of the fur trade. You just got to remember that. So, free labor source. Actually, it's different than England and in Spain. Spain forced them to work. England was pretty dependent upon the Native Americans. France, on the other hand, they lived with them. They intermarried with the Native Americans. They converted them to Catholicism. The Coureurs de Bois, they lived with the Native Americans. The Coureurs de Bois, those are runners of the woods. Those are the fur traders. So fur trade, that's just something easy to remember with New France. Do keep in mind the characteristics of the 13 colonies. I'm just going to give you a small samples. With the New England colonies, the greatest example is Massachusetts. All of these regions, the New England colonies, bad soil, cold climate, they depend upon the sea for shipbuilding, whaling, and lumber, and those sorts of trades and occupations. The middle colonies, the greatest examples would be Pennsylvania and New England. They're called the breadbasket colonies. The soil was a little bit better, the climate was a little bit more mild, and so they are growing wheat, barley, oats, all of those things over there. Many immigrants settled into this region, so it was by far the most diverse group of people. It was very religiously tolerant. See the Quakers in Pennsylvania, whereas in the New England colonies, you're seeing mostly Puritans, not as much religious tolerance. And then, of course, you've got the southern colonies. Virginia and Georgia are the greatest example, all based upon agriculture. The soil was good and rich. The climate was warm. The downside is that it was dependent upon slavery. And so it was all agricultural based, but the climate and soil enabled the South to go and raise cash crops to go and sell across the rest of the world. Keep in mind that sometimes the College Board will refer to a group of colonies called the Chesapeake colonies. Why? Because they're located right off the Chesapeake Bay. They are Virginia and Maryland. I would be familiar with that and just be aware that if they refer to the Chesapeake colonies, it's those two, Virginia and Maryland, off the Chesapeake Bay. What else can we say about some of these colonies themselves? I'm just going to give you some highlights. Religious toleration did exist. For example, over in Maryland, I think about Mary Land, Mary as in Catholicism, Mother Mary. It was set up for Catholics to begin off with, but then later on, they passed the Maryland Act of Toleration, which gives freedom of worship for all. Now, there were some restrictions. It didn't say anything about Jews, it didn't say anything about atheists or anything like that, but there was a degree of religious toleration. A great example would be that Act of Toleration. We already talked about Rhode Island. You should be aware of the religious toleration there for the heretics, such as Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. Virginia included tobacco. There was very structured society. There was a planter class who owned plantations at the top of the social pyramid. Slavery drove everything in places like Virginia, and indentured servitude was also used before Bacon's Rebellion breaks out. And then after Bacon's Rebellion, things change in a big, big way. Massachusetts, dominated by Puritans, is based upon a theocracy. You had to be a member of the church if you want to participate in the government. That all changes later on down the road, of course. There was a big emphasis on schooling, that Puritan work ethic and schooling. And so they had some of the most advanced education of the 13 colonies. Shipbuilding and trading, that was all dependent upon the climate and the soil being poor back in those times. New York, Pennsylvania, known, as mentioned earlier, known for religious toleration. Quakers, they were some of the first to call for an end to slavery and equality between the sexes as well. So huge, huge, big deal with the Quakers. I'd make sure you're familiar with that religious group. They're very progressive. And as mentioned earlier, with the South, most people think about the South. nowadays as being dependent on cotton. But in early period two, no, it's not that way. It's based upon slavery, but the three big crops that they're making money off of would be rice, indigo, and tobacco. Indigo is kind of a blue, purplish dye that was used as popular. It's made from plants, of course, but those three dominate before the cotton gin's invented, and then things changed in a big way for the South with the invention of the cotton gin. Then we become dependent upon that crop, but not just yet, not in the 16 and 1700, early 1700s. In New England, in those colonies, you're seeing experiments in self-government, especially with the town hall meetings. They elect their own officials, they raise and lower their own taxes. That's important right there for the New England town hall meetings, and they get used to this. They get used for representation in places like Virginia with the House of Burgesses, where people elect their own representatives. So be sure that you're studying the growing feeling of self-government with those two examples. I can't emphasize that enough. Be sure you know the House of Burgesses and the town hall meetings. Um, as mentioned earlier, one of the greatest things to remember about the relationship between the British and the United States was the system of mercantilism. Now, the British see us differently than what we saw them. They saw us as only serving to benefit them or the motherland with raw materials, which are then turned into finished products, which are then sold to Africa for slaves, which are then sent to the United States or the modern day United States via the Middle Passage itself. What that creates right there is something called triangle trade, where we create the raw materials, engaging a system of mercantilism. They turn a profit off of this system of mercantilism. The British go in and make products out of our raw materials. They sell them for slaves, and then those slaves are sent to mostly the Caribbean, and then some of them are sent to the 13 colonies itself. So from 1607 to 1763, the United States America, um, the 13 colonies began experiencing a time period called salutary neglect, where the British did not really enforce a lot of trade restrictions and laws. So the colonies kind of flourished almost as independent states for many, many years. Why would the colonists love it? Why was it a growing problem for the British? Think about this. They began to do things on their own. They began to feel independent and do things and trade with other countries, especially the Dutch and that sweet, sweet Dutch tea that's out there. So when the British later on down the road began to make new laws and start to make more restrictions on trade and pass new taxes, the colonists kind of feel shortchanged, like, wait a minute, why are things changing for us? And so that does cause some of them to smuggle, in other words, trade illegally and get illegal items from other countries. And they do that kind of underhandedly. And under the system of mercantilism, that is supposed to be the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to be providing raw materials for the mother country and not smuggling. Quit smuggling, colonists. But they were engaging in triangle trade with the raw materials from the colonies, finished products in England. Guns were then traded for slaves over in Africa along the Middle Passage, and it just continues on from there forward. So, as mentioned earlier, slavery. Slavery does begin to spread within the 13 colonies, and it happens after a moment in Virginia called Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion was started by a man named Nathaniel Bacon, who himself was actually pretty wealthy. But the indentured servants over in Virginia were getting very frustrated. Number one, they were being attacked by Native Americans, and nothing was being done about it. Number two, all the good land had been taken already. All the good land had been taken by the wealthy landowners. So these people would get done with their contracts and their contracted labor, and they'd find that they had no place to go and set up home. So they protest for some changes within the government. Basically, no changes happen. So the worst moment is when these group of poor indentured servants go on to burn down Jamestown over in Virginia. Now, what this does is this convinces the wealthy elite of Virginia at the time that we don't need to have indentured servants anymore because we see what they've done. We've seen how they gather. We've seen how they burn down Jamestown. We don't want this to ever happen again. So the future for indentured servants is honestly, there isn't one. They're going to go and start to engage in the slave trade. So as we close out this period to review, I do want to briefly mention that we're starting to kind of make our way over into the French and Indian War. Now, in the next video, we'll spend a little bit more time on the French and Indian War itself. but the English will win this war, but at what cost? At what cost? They'll finally have to pay for that war. And as we kind of go and make our way into the mid 1700s, worldwide, we're starting to see some big changes. In America, you're seeing the emergence of the First Great Awakening. There was a lowering of attendance in churches, so pastors began to think of new ways to get people to get involved in church. So the First Great Awakening included pastors like George Whitefield. George Whitefield was an itinerant pastor, meaning he would travel from city to city preaching the gospel. They had outdoor camp meetings during this time. He was called a New Light pastor because he was not a traditional pastor behind the pulpit in a sanctuary, so they'd worship outdoors. And he's known for revivalism, a lot of systems of revivalism. There's also Jonathan Edwards, the most famous hellfire and brimstone pastor. So hellfire, that's explanatory, self-explanatory. Brimstone is sulfur, actually. It's the old word for sulfur. What happens when you burn sulfur? It smells like rotten eggs. And that's actually supposed to be what hell smells like rotten eggs. So he was called a hellfire and brimstone pastor, and he gives a very famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where quite literally he was trying to, and y'all know that I'm being PC about this too, but and I'm not trying to be. It's going to sound goofy, but I don't mean for it to be. He's quite literally trying to scare the hell out of the people that were listening to it. So it had images of that God was angry with you and dangling you like a spider above the pit of hell. And so it really, really concerned people. It really was a different change and a shift in the way that things were being done as far as church goes. Um, you're seeing the emergence of new denominations. I'd be familiar with the Baptist and the Methodist. New denominations are starting to flourish during this time, during this First Great Awakening. The biggest thing I want to mention about the First Great Awakening is that people are making their own decisions. They're finding that they don't have to go through a minister in order to find salvation and make their own decisions about their own personal choice about salvation. So the question I ask my students is always, if you make your own decisions about your own salvation, can you do that as also about your own political decisions as well? And of course, the answer would be yeah. The Enlightenment, huge, huge, huge. Be familiar with it as well, emphasizing reason rather than emotion. There's a big push for deism during this time. That's where God created the world, God created the universe, and then he just kind of left this alone and moved on to bigger and better things. Therefore, there are people like Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist, who would say, well, but since God is no longer with us, that means that we have to make important decisions ourselves. So the Enlightenment, the deist movement is starting to emerge. You get famous Enlightenment philosophers such as John Locke promoting natural rights, tabula rasa, that the mind is a blank slate and that anybody's capable of going in and not being indoctrinated. You can make your own decisions. He said if a government does not go in and protect your rights, you should overthrow it. You have Jean-Jacques Rousseau with a social contract. We agree to follow the laws of a government as long as the government answers to the will of the people. And if the government doesn't do that, then what do we do? Well, John Locke would say, we overthrow them. Charles Montesquieu also went on promoting the separation of powers, the three branches of government that we still see as well. During the 1700s, you see the emergence of newspapers. The famous trial of John Peter Zenger himself. Zenger was accused of criticizing a British official. He was put on trial. He was actually found not guilty. And so this actually encourages more and more criticism within the newspapers themselves. It's a huge moment. And then you get a very American identity beginning to emerge. People like Benjamin Franklin with a famous Poor Richard's Almanac. Now, Poor Richard's Almanac is basically a listing and a word in a big book of witty words and advice for Americans as well. And the publication of his autobiography as well, huge moments where this is all going on. So the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening both encourage rebellion and against authority. I would be able to answer why is that as well. Of course, there is still resistance to authority as far as slaves go. And so in 1739, the Stono Rebellion actually broke out. What happened for this is the fact that the Spaniards began telling slaves in South Carolina, if you made it to Florida, you get your freedom. And so there was a big movement for all that. There was a group that tried to go in and begin the revolt and begin to go and run down to Florida. It was put down by a militia, but it does result into stronger slave codes themselves. All of these slave rebellions, whether it be Stono or the Nat Turner Rebellion, that's what they all amount to in the end. Stronger slave codes. So slaves did resist work by working slowly, or by breaking things, breaking tools, by sabotage or theft, murder, by running away, by fleeing, sometimes by starting fires to cause a distraction. And so by 1662, there are a series of slave laws that had been around for a while before the Stono Rebellion. The first one that you need to be familiar with is the Virginia Slave Law, where they literally codified slavery itself. Like, you inherit your status based upon your mother. So if your mother was a slave, then you inherit that status. So they began codifying what slaves could and could not do. And as you go through and see the rest of these as well, they couldn't own guns, they can't be in large groups. And then later on, they become even more strict. Like, you can't testify against an accuser. All these things are to keep these people in a system and a style of slavery itself. All right, everybody. I hope that that was kind of helpful. I've tried to give you some things that I want you to think about studying. And I know I only scratched the surface with some of these topics, but if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to help out. Good luck, everybody.